hear that Colonel Brandon has been with you a good deal.
Yes.
You should try for him, Eleanor. You should indeed. And I do think you might have a chance there. You have it in you to attract the men, if you were to go about it the right way.
As we know, John Dashwood is the half-brother of Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret, and the sole heir to Noland Park. But the moment his father dies, something very Austen-like begins to happen.
You must help them.
Well, of course.
You must promise to do this.
John starts with a promise, a heartfelt one that should shape the rest of his actions, and then it doesn't. Now, I used to think John was a decent sort, a bit dim, perhaps malleable, maybe even a touch soft-hearted, until Fanny got a hold of him. But rereading the novel, I'm not so sure. What if he was never quite so noble to begin with? What if he sought out Fanny's persuasion, not because he was easily led, but because he wanted to be led? So in this episode, I'll explore John Dashwood's slow moral erosion, a man who shrinks his responsibilities down until they fit neatly inside a polite excuse. So we meet John Dashwood before we meet his failure. His father, Henry Dashwood, lies on his deathbed in the opening chapter of the novel, making one final plea that his only son will look after his stepmother and half-sisters when he's gone. It's not a legally binding request, but a moral one that John appears to receive with all the earnestness expected of a gentleman and a son. Austen writes, "He was not an ill-disposed young man, unless to be rather cold-hearted and rather selfish is to be ill-disposed. But he was in general well respected, for he conducted himself with propriety in the discharge of his ordinary duties." And just like that, Jane Austen frames him for us, a man who wants to be seen as upright, but who lacks the internal resources to become it. What makes John compelling, though not in a flattering way, isn't just that he fails to live up to his father's wishes, it's how quickly and how easily he rewrites his own understanding of those wishes to suit himself.
Help them? What do you mean, help them?
Dearest, I mean to give them £3,000.
At first he considers giving his sisters a generous sum, £3,000. But the longer he thinks about it, and the more he confers with Fanny, the smaller his imagined gift becomes. 3,000 becomes 1,500, then a few hundred, and then reduced to perhaps some small acts of kindness here and there.
General concern for their welfare, occasional presents of fish and game and so forth.
Exactly.
Until eventually the gift disappears altogether. And John is still convinced he's doing right. He doesn't just break his promise, he revises it until it no longer requires anything of him. This is where the idea of John as weak-willed gets more complicated. Yes, Fanny plays a significant role in talking him down, but this isn't someone who goes kicking and screaming. This is a man who enters into an emotional transaction with himself. He trades his father's request for his wife's reasoning, and convinces himself he's not only justified, but prudent.
Upon my word, I do believe you're right.
You can see it in both the book and the 1995 and 2008 adaptations. John is not a bumbling fool he appears to be at first glance. That's part of Austen's sleight of hand. He may not be cruel, but he's not innocent either. He knows how to hold the pose of virtue while sidestepping any actual sacrifice. Adaptation comparisons, the father's final wish. This early moment, Henry Dashwood's dying request, sets the emotional groundwork for the entire novel. But how each adaptation chooses to frame it varies greatly. In the 2008 Andrew Davies version, the scene is emotionally heightened and visually intimate. We even see Mrs. Dashwood sitting in the room, watching her husband make the plea to his son. This framing deepens the sense of betrayal we feel later, because Mrs. Dashwood is not just aware of the promise, she witnesses it. It makes John's failure all the more personal and Fanny's cruelty even colder. In contrast, the 95 Emma Thompson film does include the deathbed scene with Tom Wilkinson's poignant portrayal of Henry Dashwood, but it's a private exchange between father and son. Mrs. Dashwood is absent. The absence softens the sense of personal betrayal, making John's failure feel more like a neglect of duty than a direct wound to his stepmother. As for the 71 and 81 adaptations, both are more faithful to the book's structure. The deathbed scene is mentioned rather than dramatised, closer to Austen's style, where the emotional weight is carried by narration rather than performance. Neither version shows Mrs. Dashwood as witness to the promise. And the novel itself, the scene unfolds in narration. Mr. John Dashwood had not the strong feelings of the rest of the family, but he was affected by a recommendation of such a nature at such a time, and he promised to do everything in his power to make them comfortable. His father was rendered easy by such an assurance, and Mr. John Dashwood had then leisure to consider how much more might prudently be in his power to do for them. There's no mention of Mrs. Dashwood being present, so that moment in the 2008 version, it's an invention, but a clever one. It sharpens the emotional stakes and gives Mrs. Dashwood a clearer position of moral witness, something the novel implies but doesn't dramatise. It's a good reminder of how adaptations can add layers that, while not in the text, often honour its emotional truth. When we talk about John Dashwood's moral failure, we often point to the conversation between him and Fanny, the moment when his promise to his dying father begins to dissolve. But what's fascinating is how it happens. Jane Austen doesn't show us a man wrestled to the ground by his domineering wife. She shows us a man who was already halfway to selfishness and just needed a little nudge.
People always live forever when there is an annuity to be paid them.
This isn't a scene about manipulation, it's a study in self-justification. John doesn't protest much. He brings up his father's request, yes, but he's looking for reasons not to follow through. And Fanny, ever strategic, offers them in abundance.
What on earth could 4 women want for more than that? Their housekeeping will be nothing at all. They'll have no carriage, no horses, hardly any servants, and will keep no company.
One by one, she hands him rationalizations, and John welcomes them. This moment is so well written because it feels real. It's not a dramatic betrayal. It's the quiet erosion of intention. John talks himself into believing that what he's doing is not only acceptable, but sensible. And in doing so, he reveals that his generosity was never truly secure. It was provisional, based on convenience, not principle. Adaptation comparisons. The 95 film stages this scene brilliantly. It's played with restraint and dark comedy. John, portrayed by James Fleet, starts out with blustery confidence,
Dearest, I mean to give them £3,000.
only to gradually retreat into passive agreement as Fanny talks circles around him. It's excruciating and very funny, but also deeply telling. John wants to be seen as honourable, but not at the cost of actual sacrifice.
Such a gift will certainly discharge my promise, my father.
The 2008 adaptation makes a slightly different choice. John seems more fussy, more indecisive. He bumbles and frets, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of helping, but unwilling to own his own discomfort.
Perhaps the matter does require further thought, but I'm determined to help them, Fanny.
It leans harder into his weakness and casts Fanny as the real driver. But even then, John isn't a victim. He's a man happy to be persuaded when it serves him. What Austen is really doing. This isn't just about broken promises. It's Austen showing us how easily people can abandon principle when it threatens their comfort. John never outright says, "I won't help them." Instead, he lets logic, his version of logic, carry him to a more self-serving conclusion. It's the quietest form of betrayal, the one that looks like reasonableness. And that's what makes John Dashwood so frustrating. He doesn't twirl, a villainous moustache, and he doesn't throw the Dashwoods into the street with a laugh. He tells himself he's being prudent, that he's doing what's right for his own family. But deep down, he knows, and we know, he's shrinking away from the very thing he promised to uphold. By the time John reappears in the later chapters of the novel, the dust has settled. His stepmother and sisters are no longer fresh in his conscience. They're living in Devonshire, removed from his daily concerns, and London has drawn his focus back to society, status, and connections. This is when we see the full evolution of John's self-image, not as someone who failed in his duty, but as someone who now fancies himself as a kind of benevolent strategist. He offers no money, no support, but he offers opinions, and in his mind that counts. A convenient marriage, not just for Edward. While some adaptations hint at John awkwardly involving himself in Eleanor's marital prospects, the novel doesn't go so far as to have him directly suggest Colonel Brandon.
I hear that Colonel Brandon has been with you a good deal.
The closest we get is a line where he asks if Brandon has been visiting, but that's a stretch to call that matchmaking. If anything, it's just more of John's oblivious commentary.
You should try for him, Eleanor. You should indeed. And I do think you might have a chance there. You have it in you to attract the men, if you were to go about it the right way.
Later still, in chapter 50, he speaks of Lucy's marriage to Robert with cheery acceptance. It's all for the best, he says. Never mind that his own brother-in-law was heartbroken, disinherited, and disgraced for the same connection.
Whatever objections there had been to another connection, you understand me, it would have been by far the least evil of the two, and she would be glad now to compound for nothing worse.
John doesn't question the shift. He simply adapts his view to fit the new arrangement, as if it had always been right. If Lucy is now Robert's wife, then she must have always been a suitable match. In John's mind, whatever is convenient must also be right. And this is where Austen is at her most cutting, not through drama, but through calm absurdity. John shows no awareness of contradiction. He believes he's being fair, balanced, and even insightful. Social graces, hollow gestures. John's entire personality orbits around appearance. He is civil, he visits, he makes polite suggestions, he expresses concern, but only the sort that doesn't require personal sacrifice. He thrives on looking thoughtful, not being thoughtful. This is why his attempts at generosity often feel like performance. He talks of marriages, family, and responsibility, but his actions remain skin deep. There's no real risk, no cost to himself, and that's the precise point Austen seems to make.
After you, my dear, of course.
In John Dashwood, we meet a man who believes social niceties are moral virtues, that civility is the same thing as character. But Eleanor, Edward, and even Marianne prove otherwise, that quiet resilience, loyalty, and integrity are worth far more than polite speeches. Adaptation comparisons. In the 95 film, John is particularly effective in this phase. His helpfulness comes across as cluelessly smug, not intentionally cruel, but socially tone deaf. We get the sense that he really believes he's being kind.
If that is agreeable to you, of course.
My dear John, this is your home now.
The 2008 version takes a subtler path. John is cooler, more reserved. His social blindness is less humorous, but more unsettling. He blends in with London's drawing rooms, the kind of man who knows how to behave correctly, but never how to behave justly. Why this scene matters. This chapter of John's arc is vital. It shows us that his selfishness isn't momentary, it's sustained, and more than that, it's disguised as helpfulness. By late in the novel, he's not wringing his hands over how little he gave. He's confidently inserting himself into other people's futures, trying to shape lives with advice when he failed them through action.
Mrs. Ferrers has quite definite intentions for your cousin Edward's marriage.
Oh?
The lady is the Honourable Miss Morton,
Miss Morton?
with £30,000, a very desirable connection on both sides.
While his actions are not intended as the cruelty of open malice, they are the erosion of duty disguised as civility, and in Austen's world, that might even be more dangerous. As the eldest son of Henry Dashwood, John is the one in line to inherit Norland, the heir who should, by rights and expectations, be the centre of family continuity, and yet he feels oddly peripheral to the emotional heart of Sense and Sensibility. Why? Part of it, I think, lies in the bloodline and belonging. John is the son of Henry Dashwood's first marriage. Eleanor, Marianne and Margaret are the daughters of his second marriage. That, of course, makes them half-sisters. And in a time when inheritance and name were everything, being only half related could mean being only half obligated, especially in the minds of people like John, or more tellingly, Fanny. We're not told much about John's upbringing, but one of your viewer comments, and I'll put it on the screen here, raised a fascinating possibility. A question I have always had: why did John Dashwood not have much of a relationship with his stepmother and half-sisters, or for that matter his father? I seem to remember reading that if a mother died, it would be her family that raised her children, not the father. Brackets, Frank Churchill. If true for John, it might explain his behaviour and weakness to a degree, and how Fanny ruled the roost. It's a compelling theory, and it might explain why John, despite his title as brother, never feels part of the Dashwood core. He has the name, but not the bond. That distance becomes even more striking when you consider his replacements. Sir John Middleton becomes a better brother, not by duty, but by warmth and action.
He says he saw the opportunity to do a good turn and was glad to take it. Such kindness from a man we have never even met.
Colonel Brandon becomes a protector. Even Edward, reserved and uncertain, shows more warmth and emotional courage than John ever manages. So Jane Austen, I think, is playing with something subtle here. Biological ties don't guarantee moral responsibility. John is not cruel. He's not violent or scheming or loud, but his absence of care, his neglect, becomes a defining trait. In a novel that's obsessed with who owes what to whom, John is the man who owes the most and gives the least. Adaptation comparisons. The brother we forget. Interestingly, the adaptations mirror this marginalisation. Once John makes his appearance in the early part of the story, he fades. In the 95 version, he's almost remembered for his amusing bewilderment and cheerful snobbery. In the 2008 adaptations, he's quieter and more conservative, but equally forgettable by the story's end. And maybe that's the point. John Dashwood is the inheritor of Norland, but not of the family's heart. He holds the estate, but not the memory. He has the means to act, and he chooses not to. And that absence of warmth and action, and of genuine kinship, becomes his quiet legacy. He is quite literally the forgotten brother. So as we see, John Dashwood doesn't get a dramatic send-off. There's no moment of reckoning, no confrontation, no real growth. And that, perhaps more than anything, is the point. He drifts quietly out of the story, believing himself to be virtuous, involved, and generous. But I think Austen does this deliberately. His arc isn't about redemption or change, it's about exposure. We're meant to notice that he doesn't evolve, and perhaps we're meant to reflect on how many respectable people do just that, step in briefly, off a little, and then vanish when it's no longer convenient to stay. The novel's ending. As far as I can tell, John makes one last appearance in chapter 50, not to express regret or gratitude or even familial affection, but to offer a little social tidbit. Lucy and Robert are doing well, and Mrs. Ferrers is perfectly reconciled. It's not warmth or reflection, it's gossip. And here's where I'd love to hear what you think. Is this Austen's way of showing that some people can be both close to the heart of the story and completely untouched by it?
She is in truth an excellent woman, and it grieves me to see her so distressed.
Because while Eleanor, Marianne, Edward, and even Lucy experience transformations, John remains exactly who he was, polished, polite, and passive. Adaptation comparison. In the adaptations that I've been focusing on, this final fade-out is handled with care. We don't get closure from John, just his continued presence, smiling blandly at the weddings, and nodding at the happy endings that he had no hand in creating. If anything, his presence becomes symbolic. He's the man who thinks he's been part of the emotional journey, but never actually went on it. So where does John Dashwood leave us? He's not the centre of drama, he's not stirring up scandal, and he's not a dramatic character. But that's what makes him worth watching, because Austen uses him to show how someone can cause real hurt simply by doing very little at all. He's the man who talks himself into virtue while quietly stepping away from it. The man who almost does the right thing and then finds dozens of reasons not to do anything. The novel is full of passionate love, sharp heartbreak, and grand moral choices. But John Dashwood stands for something quieter, the damage done by hesitation, self-interest, and a polite shrug of the shoulders. And perhaps that's what stays with us, not because he's loud or malicious, but because he's familiar. We've all seen someone like John. Perhaps there's a little of John Dashwood in us, wanting to seem good rather than doing good. What Austen does is quite revealing. She doesn't exaggerate him. She holds up a mirror to help us notice the difference between intentions and actions. They don't reflect. If you stayed with me through this exploration, thank you. I know John Dashwood may not be the flashiest character in the book, but sometimes it's those quieter presences that leave the deepest impacts or impressions. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like. It really does help. And if you've got thoughts about John, his choices, or the way he's been portrayed in the different adaptations, then the comment section is of course open and always fascinating. And of course, if you'd like to explore more of my exploration of Sense and Sensibility, then here's my playlist right here for you. So until the next one, thanks for watching and bearing with. I'll see you later. Bye for now.